Okay, let's just hold on one more minute and we'll get started. We've got some people still streaming in. Thank you, everyone. Welcome. Okay, everyone, let's get started. I've got about 7:02. We got a lot to talk about tonight. I want to just say good evening, everyone. Welcome to the ACPMP Educational Webinar Series. We extend a very special welcome to our guest presenter, Dr. Andreana Holowatyj, for her presentation titled, Let's Talk About Our Genes, a Familial Hereditary Link. This is the first in ACPMP's new webinar series, and what a perfect guest we have tonight to launch the program. With this new series, ACPMP aims to focus on evolving innovation and cutting-edge topics of interest to the appendix cancer community. We have, again, well over 400 people who registered to attend tonight, and they are participating from all around the world. So I know many of you are familiar with ACPMP and what we do, but for those who are not, just a very brief word about our primary mission. Our mission is twofold here at ACPMP. One, we support funds for research to accelerate the discovery of new treatments for appendix cancer. And our hope is to one day find a cure through that research. Two, ACPMP supports and funds educational programs for physicians, patients, and their loved ones, and to help increase awareness. Our mission of funding research and education, importantly, is made possible solely through the generosity of you, our donors. And we just want to say that we're grateful for each and every one. I also wanted to take a quick second to give kind of a shameless plug to our biggest fundraiser, biggest walk, the biggest event that we have to really increase awareness. That's our annual walk. Registration for it is open now. And please, if you want more information about that, we welcome your participation. It's a lot of fun, great way to raise awareness. Please go to our website at www.acpmp.org. Now, just for a couple of very brief housekeeping items. Your lines are muted, especially with 420 people. You can imagine that we have to do that. But please, we welcome all questions. If you have a question for Dr. Holowatyj, please submit it through the Q&A function. We will not be able to see your questions if you submit them through the chat function. Please, again, submit them through the Q&A function, which should be at the bottom of your screen. This program is being recorded, and you will be able to have access to it as a registrant immediately following. And finally, if you have any questions about our educational series, if you have ideas about topics of interest or anything related, please feel free to contact me. My contact information is there on the screen, deborah.s@acpmp.org. Okay, so now it's my great pleasure to introduce our guest presenter tonight, Dr. Andreana Holowatyj, who has a very impressive background, so I do want to share that. Dr. Holowatyj is an assistant professor of medicine and cancer biology at the Vanderbilt Ingram Cancer Center, Vanderbilt University Medical Center. She has worked tirelessly and passionately for over 10 years to really understand cancer development, both in the clinic and in the laboratory settings. Dr. Holowatyj earned her PhD in medicine at the Wayne State University School of Medicine and Kremenis Cancer Institute in Michigan. She then became an NIH Fellow in Genomic Medicine and then was an endowed postdoc fellow in cancer research at the University of Utah. She also earned an MS in clinical investigation at the University of Utah School of Medicine. And now at Vanderbilt, Dr. Holowatyj is dedicated to closing the major gap in understanding appendiceal cancer biology and epidemiology in order to make critical advances in disease prevention, detection, treatment, and outcomes. Dr. Holowatyj has served on the expert panel for the American Joint Committee on Cancer Staging Manual, the 9th edition on cancers of the appendix. And ACPMP is especially privileged to have Dr. Holowatyj serve as chair of ACPMP's Scientific Advisory Board, where she leads our new research grant program. Stay tuned, we have 2 new grant awardees. We'll be making that announcement public in the next few days. Dr. Holowatyj's research has led to the first studies of appendix cancer genetics, biology, epidemiology, and outcomes for young patients, including of the first hereditary familial link to hereditary cancer. She also has discovered that approximately 1 of every 3 individuals diagnosed with appendix cancer is younger than 50 years of age, 50. These findings have contributed to the development of the GAP study, which brings us all here tonight. That is where Dr. Holowatyj and her team are working to discover how changes in genes may contribute to appendix cancer development. Dr. Holowatyj and her team also hopes to learn how genetic changes inherited from a parent may increase the likelihood of developing appendix cancer. Dr. Holowatyj, we thank you for being such an active contributor to ACPMP. We are so fortunate to have a force like you on our team and that of the appendix cancer patient community. And so with that, the floor is yours, and let's talk about our genes.
Let's do it, Deborah. And thank you so much for that much too kind introduction overall. Let me get started by sharing my screen here. I know we already have an active Q&A, so I appreciate folks chiming in, and we'll get started right here. Overall, so as Deborah said, the title of my talk this evening is Let's Talk About Our Genes. I hope that as a result of this educational webinar, not only am I going to teach you some of our most recent findings, some of where the field is moving and about the GAP study, but I really hope to conclude this with a dialogue and being able to also answer some pressing and important questions whereby which that I can answer this evening overall. So let me just get started noting my disclosures from having the true privilege of chairing the Scientific Advisory Board for the ACPMP Research Foundation, some of my grant funding, and also serving on the AJCC expert panel for version 9 staging of the appendix and in the peritoneal surface malignancies consortium. And so if you registered for the webinar, you probably saw the descriptor of what I'm hoping to talk about with you this evening. The first of which is the new finding that about 1 in every 10 folks with appendix cancer has a genetic change associated with cancer predisposition. The idea of considering genetic testing for all patients with appendix cancer and how this information may help us identify at-risk family members who could also benefit. How you could participate in a clinical study if you've been diagnosed with appendix cancer in the United States to help us learn more about a potential hereditary link to this disease called the GAP study, and then move on to questions about appendix cancer genetics, and also including a feature on how to possibly find a genetic counselor in your area if that's something of interest. But as many of you know, the appendix is a vestigial organ illustrated right here off the right side of the colon. It's about 10 centimeters tall. And the lifetime appendectomy risk in the United States is relatively high, higher of which for females, about 23% for females compared with 12% of males. And the appendix cancer age-adjusted incidence rates about 0.12 per million person years. What this really means is appendix cancer is rare. And I put rare in quotes because sometimes that's a tricky word to use overall, but as defined by the NCI, it is a rare cancer type where we see about 3,000 new cases diagnosed with appendix cancer each year in the United States. So one of the striking things that really piqued my interest a few years ago was a paper published by Singh and colleagues demonstrating that the incidence of appendiceal adenocarcinoma has increased over 232%, in fact, over the last 2 decades. To walk you through this figure a little bit, you can see the incidence rate in an annual percent change on the y-axis here, where the numbers on the left side of the column, and then we've broken this up by age group overall. And there's a couple interesting points that I'd like to share with you from this figure. The first of which is we see overall across all age groups, with a minor exception among those in their 70s, an increasing incidence. So this is something we're seeing this disease incidence increase across all age groups overall. But what really struck me, if I orient you to this orange bar here, is the 2 graphs to the left of the orange bar, which are individuals ages 15 to 39 and those ages 40 to 49, or essentially the group of adults under age 50 years. And we really see a marked and consistent annual percentage change with an increasing incidence of appendiceal adenocarcinoma. And that really made me want to ask, well, why is this happening? Is there something that we should be looking at, particularly in young patients overall? So why is this happening? One of the things that we can ask ourselves, could that just be as a result of the fact that we're having an increase in the diagnosis of these tumors? Essentially, are more appendectomies being performed over this time period that could explain this increasing incidence? And the answer is likely no. So from this same paper, I'm showing you their graph where they looked at the rates of appendectomies over time across these same age groups. And we see pretty consistent rate in appendectomies over this time period, suggesting to us that the increasing incidence for appendiceal adenocarcinomas is likely not related to an increase in this diagnosis of incidental tumors. But similar to the last graph where I pointed my interest in the age groups who are under 50, this was interesting to me, as might be expected that the rates of appendectomies are highest among those under the age of 50 years. And this really led me to want to ask, what is the appendix cancer burden among adults younger than age 50 years? And I realized, to my knowledge, that nobody had ever been able to study that, or nobody had studied that. So we decided to tackle that as a first question. So we did what's called a population-based study, and this was led by one of my medical students, Timothy Gibbs, at Meharry Medical College here in Nashville. We did a population-based study using data from the NIH and the National Cancer Institute, which covers about 30% of the US population overall, and identified just shy of 9,000 adults who were ages 20 years and older when they were diagnosed with a first primary appendiceal cancer. And I'm showing you a clip of a table from that article, which the QR code is also located on your screen in case you'd like to read up further on the paper. But what I draw your attention to in this table is the proportion of cases that were diagnosed with their first appendix cancer under the age of 50 years. And we saw that just about 30%, or 1 in every 3 patients with an appendix cancer was younger than age 50 at diagnosis, which we typically term early onset. cancer or appendix cancer. This 1 in every 3 was particularly striking to me because I like to put it into perspective. Among patients with a colorectal cancer, we see about 1 in every 8 patients under the age of 50 years. So the number of 1 in every 3 is particularly high, or disproportionately so, one could say. And so answering the first question, of course, led me to a second one. And that was, could this disproportionate burden of early onset disease suggest that there's a potential for hereditary factors to contribute to appendix cancer development? And such, we went on to start to ask the question, well, what about hereditary factors in appendix cancer? If you look at published and publicly available websites, some will say it's generally agreed it's not hereditary, no genetic factors known to cause this disease, or appendix cancer is not run in families. And as a consequence of that, some of the clinical guidelines in oncology that would help direct genetic or familial high-risk assessment actually do not include genetic testing guidelines for patients with an appendix cancer. So before I jump into some of our actual findings in this space, I don't want this to be a college biology lecture, but I want to ensure we're all on the same page with some terminology. So I kind of want to take it a little back to the basics for a slide or two before we jump into our recent discoveries. And that starts with our human body. So human body is made up of 37 trillion cells overall. And germline cells are the ones that contain the genetic information that we pass down over generations. Every cell in the body, every one of these 37 trillion, has a copy of all of your DNA, and that holds your genetic code. So think of it like a library overall. So in the figure on the left, you see your cell, one cell with your nucleus in it. And then you see these chromosomes, which are essentially DNA tightly wound. But if you unwind that, as has been done in this figure, you can see your DNA, and each cell in your body has a copy of all of your DNA, and that holds your genetic code. So much like that genetic code would be like a library in terms of DNA, we have genes that are segments of your DNA. We have about 20,000 of them. And so consider them like little instruction manuals. So genes are part of our DNA. The DNA is that library. And within this library, each gene is a tiny instruction manual directed for a specific purpose overall. And so whether you talk about Spider-Man or the Incredible Hulk, genetic changes are variants in our DNA. So you can see illustrated here in this figure, and the person on the top, you can see the highlighted green bar here where we're reading or kind of putting out the spelling of the DNA. You can see there's a change in the DNA at the same position between person A on the top and person B on the bottom. And so this change is essentially what we call a genetic variant, or commonly and previously referred to as a genetic mutation. So a genetic variant is this change in the DNA sequence that we find in our normal or germline cells. These changes do not always cause disease. I really want to emphasize that. That's because these changes can be classified as benign, pathogenic, or of unknown significance. So having a genetic variant does not guarantee that you will develop the disease, but with additional information, it helps us understand a little bit about the risk. I'm kind of going to keep it at that high level overview for now, although of course I'm happy to take questions as we move forward. But I want to point out in the bottom right of your screen is a link and a QR code to a fantastic webinar put forth by a genetic counselor that walks you through in about the scope of an hour about cancer genetics, entitled The ABCs of Cancer Genetics. And FORCE is an amazing organization for hereditary cancers. And so I would encourage you, if you have the time or interest, to visit that webinar and have a listen. It'll break what I said down into much more depth and with additional details that for the sake of time this evening, I won't go into as far. But moving forward, I kind of want to transition to when we decided to ask that question to better understand a little bit about the genetic features or germline variants among patients with appendix cancer. This is a paper we put out in November of last year, 2022. Again, a QR code is present in the bottom of your screen if you'd like to read that paper. But I'd also like to encourage anybody who'd like to request a PDF copy of that article, who might not be able to access it via the web, to email my team at gapcancerstudy@vumc.org, and we're happy to share a copy of that with you as well. But nonetheless, I'd like to unpack what we found in this paper and really get talking about the why, or the who cares behind that as well. And so I'd like to tell you what we did and tell you a little bit about our study population before I jump to what we found, because I think it's important to contextualize that in the scope of this initial study. So we identified 176 patients who'd been diagnosed with an appendiceal cancer and underwent genetic testing via a clinical multi-gene panel test between the ages of 18 and 89 at a national clinical testing laboratory. And we excluded 45 cases that had a known appendiceal neuroendocrine or carcinoid tumor, or mixed neuroendocrine, non-neuroendocrine tumor known as a menin, because we know that the biology of those types of tumors is distinct from carcinomas. So we were left with 131 patients in this study for further exploration. So these 181 individuals, like I mentioned, all underwent multi-gene panel testing, regardless of their age or family cancer history. Everybody was included who met these criteria. They underwent multi-gene panel testing on one of these 3 panels that I've checked on your screen. And all of these patients had tested 14 genes with a known susceptibility to different gastrointestinal cancers. And those 14 genes are listed right now in the far right side of the screen. So these are 14 genes that we know are associated with GI cancer susceptibility overall that we were able to explore in this population. And then clinical histories such as their appendix cancer diagnosis, family cancer history, etc., were all obtained from clinician-completed test forms that we were able to derive. So knowing that, let's talk about the composition of these 131 individuals, because I think that's important to recognize from this time period. So half of the cohort was actually younger than age 50 at appendix cancer diagnosis. So we have a bit higher proportion of early onset cases in this cohort relative to what we see in our population-based study. About 2/3 of patients were female, and about 20% of patients identified as a non-white racial ethnic group. Notably, 75% of patients had appendix cancer as their first cancer or an only cancer, or first of one or more cancers that they had been diagnosed with. And as might be expected, 7 out of every 8 patients reported a family history of cancer. So what did we find? Kind of the first bullet point on my webinar description, we discovered that 1 in every 10 patients with appendix cancer had a pathogenic variant in a cancer susceptibility gene. In fact, it was actually 11.5% of patients harbored at least one deleterious variant in a cancer susceptibility gene. Now, these genes that we tested and the prevalence of these sequence variations are all outlined here in the table on your screen overall. I know there have been some specific questions related to particular genes, so that information is there. I do want to point out that no methods for detecting germline variants are 100% sensitive, and we excluded variants of uncertain significance in our estimates due to an uncertain interpretation. So we took a pretty stringent approach, but this could suggest this number may be an underestimate based on these caveats here. But most importantly, that I'd like to emphasize is that when limited to cases with appendix cancer as the first and only primary tumor in this group, we see a similar proportion to the overall population, or that 10.8% of patients harbored at least one deleterious variant in a cancer susceptibility gene overall. And so here is a pie chart kind of demonstrating the spectrum of what genes we identified pathogenic variants in overall here. So the big question, particularly recently, that we want to, of course, acknowledge is, could this be an incidental finding? So we certainly acknowledge, as the first study to really look at germline genetic features in appendix cancer, that the discovery of this deleterious variants or mutations in genes with a known susceptibility to GI cancers may indeed be incidental. Indeed, a very recent single center study of about 237 appendix cancer patients also found that 10.5% of cases had at least one pathogenic germline variant. In that study, they were able to add genomic testing or testing of the tumor DNA in just a couple hundred genes overall, and identified that 8% of patients with a germline variant actually had a co-occurring change in the tumor DNA. However, there's a lack of laboratory studies to actually understand causality or understand the impact causally as to how this influences appendiceal carcinogenesis or cancer development. I emphasize that because it really makes an important point that while we're still at the tip of this iceberg, it's still an iceberg. These studies stress a timely need to discover if there are novel or new candidate genes associated with appendix cancer risk that we do not yet know about. That's where the GAP study elegantly enters the picture, but I'll get to that a little bit later. But I think we're just starting to understand pieces of this, and there is a lot more to learn, no less. But a really important question, what does this currently mean for individuals diagnosed with appendix cancer? As we published in that JAMA Oncology paper, genetic testing or evaluation of all patients diagnosed with appendix cancer, irrespective of age or family cancer history, should be considered. This is important for a few reasons. First of all, genetic testing is like a spell check. It's spell checking specific genes to look for any of those changes or variants in your normal DNA. But importantly, for patients, genetic testing could identify variants associated with an increased risk of developing a different type of cancer that could direct cancer prevention and surveillance strategies per se. Moreover, testing and genetic counseling of family members of those who have a pathogenic variant, who might be at risk of a hereditary cancer syndrome, could also direct that necessity of cancer prevention and surveillance approaches. So I've talked a lot about genetic testing. I just explained its role as really that spell checker, but I want to take a step back and briefly discuss genetic testing and counseling, given what my last slide's kind of take home point was. And I want to preface this by saying I am not a genetic counselor. I'm really fortunate to work with an amazing group of genetic counselors. And so I will likely punt and encourage you to see or speak with a genetic counselor for certain parts and specific questions. But I want to kind of explain the genetic counselor's role and what is genetic testing nonetheless. So genetic counseling often includes a discussion with a certified genetic counselor of your personal and family medical history, the benefits, the risks, the costs, and the limitations of genetic testing to be mindful of, as well as genetic privacy and discrimination laws. So it's important to consider genetic counseling before and after genetic testing if it was to be gotten, because it not only helps to discuss genetic testing, what are the different panels, who needs to be tested, and after that testing to help you understand and digest those results, no less. Like I mentioned, the actual part of genetic testing runs a spell check on your normal DNA to identify if you may have any genetic variants or changes inherited from your parents that could increase your risk of developing cancer. So a question we often get that's a really important question: does genetic testing differ from genomic testing or sequencing? The answer is yes. Genomic sequencing is testing for changes in the tumor DNA to see if any of those changes may make the cancer vulnerable to any drugs to target, versus genetic testing running a spell check on your normal DNA to understand any changes inherited from parents that could increase risk of developing cancer overall. And so I really appreciate this comic because I think it speaks to something that can often be an elephant in the room in terms of understanding your family cancer history, whether it's from relatives who may have important information about that family cancer history, whether it's exchanging information to ensure everybody is informed or not, understanding the family cancer history in depth is really important and could really help, especially if going to speak to a genetic counselor overall. So how do you do this? What are some ways to find a certified genetic counselor in your area? There are many. I'm going to highlight 3 for the sake of time, and this is for informational purposes only. But one of the opportunities to find a genetics clinic is to use the American College of Medical Genetics and Genomics online tool, which I've included the URL to that website here, to find a genetics clinic for those that might be listed local to your area. So you can see in the screenshot, I ran it for the Nashville zip code. You see multiple hits on clinic locations to be able to find a genetics clinic and consider an appointment. Most, if not all, NCI designated comprehensive cancer centers do have genetic counselors who specialize in cancer that you might be able to talk with or go see. And then, as I mentioned before, FORCE is an amazing organization focused on hereditary cancers, and they actually have a toll-free helpline, the phone number which is listed here with that extension. And that can connect you with a volunteer board-certified genetic counselor who can help you find a local genetics expert overall. So these are just some of the ways to find that, even going to your primary care physician to consider a referral. There are numerous ways overall. And like I said, these are just some for information. So the question of, do we know what genes should be included in genetic testing for patients with appendix cancers? The honest answer, we don't just yet. But in good news, I'm hopeful that we have the opportunity to answer this question together. And that gives me a really elegant segue into the genetics of appendix cancer study. I know that several GAP patients are on this call, for which I'm incredibly grateful for their participation already at this time. And I'm excited to share some of the questions the GAP study is hoping to answer and a little bit of the why and why we're asking participants for certain things. And so some of the questions we're hoping the GAP study will really be able to answer as a prospective cohort is, are there novel genes related to appendix cancer risk that we have yet to discover overall? And that was a question, I think, a couple slides back, in positing that we really need additional studies to be able to understand this. Are there genetic changes or variants underlying appendiceal cancer development that may be inherited from both biological parents? And can we find specific tumor characteristics that could lead us to new appendix cancer therapies in the process? So these are three of our main questions that we're hoping to answer in the GAP study overall. So the URL to the genetics of appendix cancer study is there at the top of your screen, www.gapcancerstudy.org. The clinicaltrials.gov number is found in the bottom right of your screen, with the QR code linking to the study website as well. So as you can see in that highlighted yellow box on the screen, the question of, is there a genetic link to appendix cancer? And involvement in the GAP study can help us really tackle this very important question and fill this crucial gap, very much pun intended, in our knowledge of appendix cancer for patients and their families. And so who is eligible to enroll in the GAP study? You are 18 years of age or older currently, have been diagnosed with an appendix cancer in the United States, and you're mentally and physically able to consent and participate in this study. So how do you possibly join the GAP study if you're interested? Well, if you visit gapcancerstudy.org and scroll down, there's a way to find out more information. We also have a tab at the top of the header that's circled here in black to join GAP, where you're met with this page on the screen where you can read about some of what you'll be asked to do, which I'm going to go over today. And then there's this shiny button at the bottom of the screen to join the GAP study that will lead you to our participation form for you to review and evaluate if you'd like to consider participating. So what do we ask you to do if you join the GAP study? We ask you to provide a small saliva sample using a curated kit that is mailed at no cost to you. We ask you to answer a brief questionnaire about your appendix cancer diagnosis and health history. And we'll ask you to share a quick update every 2 years for a short period of time. We ask for permission to allow us to study some of the tissue that a surgeon has already removed, such as during your appendectomy. We also ask permission to access or that you confidentially share medical or pathology records about your appendix cancer diagnosis, and potentially contact information for your biological parents if they might be interested in participating in the study, whereby which we would request a small saliva sample. I do want to absolutely point out that we understand that not all parents are living, able, and are willing to participate, and this is certainly an optional component of the study, no less. But I think it's really important in the scope of transparency and really partnering with patients that I explain the why behind each of these asks. So I'd like to take just a few minutes to go ahead and do that, and no less. So I kind of outlined, these are the 5 particular things: the survey, consideration of parents in study, the saliva sample, path report, and access to those tissues already removed are the permissions that we ask for. So in terms of the saliva sample, this is a reliable, non-invasive, and simple way to collect normal DNA for genetic testing. Everything you need comes in a kit mailed at no cost to you, which you can see here pictured on the screen, including a prepaid box to mail back your sample. This ask allows us to study how changes in our genes may contribute to appendix cancer development. As I mentioned, there's absolutely no cost to participants on study. We mail all the supplies to your home and provide that prepaid box to return the sample. Saliva is safe to store and ship at room temperature, and collection hopefully takes about 5 minutes, although I have completed one of these kits and it took me a couple minutes longer, but it's usually painless and easy overall to provide the sample into the tube. So a question that I want to be incredibly transparent about is, will I get my results? The answer is yes, if you choose to. Couple things about that. Research is unfortunately not as quick as clinical care. So I absolutely encourage and invite every single patient who would like to join GAP to join the study. But while we're working to run these tests as quickly as we can within our capacity, I would also encourage to evaluate seeing a genetic counselor if you'd like timely results through clinical care as well. I have screenshotted here sections from our participation form, or what we call the informed consent document, that has been approved by our review board, where we note in black and white, if we discover a clinically relevant test result, we will contact you and refer you for a clinical appointment to confirm the results on any potential additional testing overall. So if you choose to accept or to hear those results, we will share those with you when available, which I find to be very, very important for patients and their families. As I mentioned, we asked to complete a brief survey when joining the study. These include questions about your background, cancer diagnosis, family cancer history, which, as I said a couple slides back, is really important to understand, lifestyle factors, and general health. This helps us understand how some of these germline features may differ across patient groups. And we also use this as an opportunity to start to understand how we can improve health for patients diagnosed with appendix cancer. Responses are absolutely confidential. This survey can be completed on a computer, phone, or tablet using a secure and personalized link. We also have paper copies available if you'd like to receive that, and we would give you a prepaid mailer to return that survey. Completion of the GAP survey and a returned saliva sample does enter you into a monthly raffle for a $40 gift card as a recognition of your time, because we know everybody's time is valuable and we really appreciate taking the time to complete these study components overall. So I'd like to give you an example in real time. This is data collected that I ran yesterday for current GAP study participants overall. So we ask the question, have you ever had to travel more than 50 miles specifically for consultation, care, or treatment for your appendix cancer? And we give a couple examples of what may include but not be limited to. And right now, we see that 62% of patients have told us yes. So nearly 2 in every 3 patients have said they've had to travel more than 50 miles for some component of their appendix cancer care. This is helping us to possibly identify potential barriers in equitable access to clinical care or trials for patients with appendix cancer and having to travel that distance and the burden that it can carry overall. And moving on, we ask for a copy of your appendix cancer pathology or medical records, or we request access to get that if it's easier on you. This allows us to accurately confirm and collect some relative pathology information, since we know the histology of the appendix cancer can be so important related to your diagnosis. We only ask for these documents as they're important for research. Of course, they're protected by all our privacy efforts and steps that we take and remain confidential. And these reports can also include tumor genomic testing, which I just talked about, that looks at changes in your tumor DNA.
like Foundation One, Tempus, or Caris, if you've heard of those. Records can be securely uploaded using a personalized link that we can send to you, or you can mail in reports with a saliva kit overall. So really important aspect of the GAP study is we ask for permission to access tissues that have already been removed. I will note, if you are in the midst of your care and using these tissues potentially for a second opinion, I have directly spoken with participants and will not request the tissue until we're sure that everything that is needed for clinical care is completed, because my number one priority is the patient, and that tissue should go for clinical care before research, although we are grateful for the permission to access that. So we request this access to tissues removed from your body that was saved by the pathology department. This is really important because this has the opportunity to help us understand the impact of those variants that we identify on appendix cancer development overall. It also could help us start answering the question that could things that we identify as tumor features also lead to potential new therapies for this patient population. I also want to point out, because I think this is really important, per our study protocol, these tissues will not be completely used up. They do not get damaged and they do not get destroyed. And the tissues do get returned to the hospital after research is complete. Lastly, as I mentioned, and an optional component of study is GAP parent, or requesting information to contact your biological parents after you've had the opportunity to discuss this with them. So we ask to contact them to help us learn about how genetic changes inherited from a parent and both parents may increase the likelihood of developing appendiceal cancer. If they choose to participate, they'll be asked to provide one saliva sample using a similar kit to the ones GAP study participants get, also mailed at absolutely no cost to them, and just a short one-page saliva collection form to help us accurately evaluate that sample, no less. And so I told you about, at this point, all the reasons of why we ask for these 5 components in the GAP study. And I really want to conclude with my team's why. Why are we doing this? Why are we partnering with patients? And it's because of you. I know so many people want to know the answer or the why behind the cause of appendix cancer or a hereditary component of this disease. And our patients, as illustrated in this very kind note that we recently received with a saliva collection kit, our patients, you all, are our why for doing this. And I cannot express sufficient gratitude personally and on behalf of my entire team to all of our current GAP study participants, to all those who are considering to join the GAP study. Without you, this wouldn't be possible. And our hope is, if we can partner with as many patients as we can across the country, then we have the really unique opportunity to answer some of these important questions that I've left you with today.
So that said, if you're on the GAP study, you've likely had the opportunity to interact with one of these amazing people who I'm fortunate to have on my team. They are real. I know they often probably speak with you over the phone or email, but the GAP study in my lab would not function without the meaningful and amazing contributions of all these folks on your screen, as well as many others. My hope is that together with y'all, we can fill this crucial gap in our knowledge of appendiceal cancer for patients and their families. We're making headway. We have a lot more to do, hopefully, with your help. So with that, in addition to acknowledging our GAP study participants, there are a myriad of folks whom to thank for different parts of the study, for different aspects of the research that we're doing, including ACPMP Research Foundation is an amazing organization who's helped start to spread the word of the GAP study, as well as many patients who've done that. Our clinical partners at Vanderbilt, as well as clinical colleagues across the United States that are sharing information about GAP to also help us on this really important mission, and our funding that's helped make this possible. I'm putting this slide up mostly for taking screenshots or revisiting in the context of the webinar for references related to things that I spoke to, or some websites of some of these definitions, which I've called out in this evening's webinar for reference or to visit and gather more information. But I'd like to conclude, number one, with the gap studies information on the bottom of your screen, email, website, and phone number to feel free to reach out to us or evaluate if you'd like to consider joining the study. As mentioned, we're happy to share this paper with you if you'd like more information on that. The main page of the GAP study website has a patient-facing science animation video that's freely available that also summarizes our study's findings that I've shared with you here today. And lastly, please consider joining the GAP study, share it with other patients whom you know. We truly can do this and only can do this together. And so with that, I'm gonna wrap up and let's get to the let's talk about part together. I just wanna first say thank you all for joining on a Thursday evening or visiting this recording if you happen to listen to it after the live component of this. And thank you for the opportunity to be able to share some of this work overall.
Fantastic. Thank you, Dr. Holowatyj. Wow, you have given us a wealth of information. Yes, let's talk. Let's get to some questions. We have quite a few through the pre-submits, as well as you were presenting, our Q&A box was rolling with questions. And again, as a reminder to the participants, please submit your questions through the Q&A box. Dr. Holowatyj will try to get as many as she can, just checking the time. So we have about a half hour or so. So let's see, let's get started. So I guess one question that we get a lot at ACPMP and that I see here in the Q&A box, we have a lot of confusion about the concepts of genomic sequencing versus genetic testing. Sometimes we hear about ctDNA testing. Can you help us unpack all of that and kind of walk through some of the key differences?
Yeah, sure. That's a fantastic question, Deborah. So genetic testing is really that spell checking process of your normal DNA. So the DNA that's in every single one of your normal cells overall, to understand what changes may have been inherited from a parent that could contribute to increased cancer risk. Genomic sequencing and testing, and I should say each of these are valuable in their own lane. Genomic sequencing or testing evaluates tumor DNA. And so the reason we want to understand DNA from those tumor cells is to understand if there are any vulnerabilities to that, to the cancer that we may be able to exploit via therapeutic approaches. So are there potential therapies given some possible changes in the tumor DNA overall? So each is informative in their own right, and both look at changes in DNA. But one is for the normal cells and one is for the tumor cells.
Okay. Thank you. That's good clarity. So can genetic testing, let's focus since that's where we are tonight, genetic testing, can that be used to screen for appendix cancer?
You know, I would caution to that right now. I think we only have 2 studies to date, and neither one is really causal studies, meaning laboratory investigations to actually understand causality. We're hopeful that we're moving in that direction in my laboratory right now.
But I think the primary focus that I can speak to for our paper published in JAMA Oncology is seeing this prevalence of pathogenic variants in appendiceal cancer patients, that there should be consideration of genetic testing for all patients, regardless of family cancer history or age, for genetic testing.
Okay.
I'm going to jump in here and tackle a couple of these
Yeah,
awesome.
good. Yeah,
Okay.
because we just got 7 in the past 2 minutes, so go for it.
So there's 2 on the GAP study that are quick answers. The GAP study is for folks with lamin, PMP of appendiceal origin. We're actually even open to patients with appendiceal nets. As long as you've been diagnosed with an appendix cancer, you're eligible to participate. Lamin, Hammond, goblet cell, signet ring cell, mucinous, non-mucinous, minin, net. We encourage your participation in this study. And an interesting question on if a patient has already had genetic testing done and it was negative for the 14 variations, are they still eligible and encouraged to participate in the GAP study? And absolutely, we're hopeful to expand beyond those 14 genes for testing in the GAP study. And we even welcome you to upload copies of those reports in when you join the GAP study, as that will be helpful as well if you choose to do so.
Okay, so I'm going to take those off my list. Can I ask you another?
Absolutely, that's what I'm.
Okay. Okay, so why would a patient want to undergo genetic testing if they already know they have appendix cancer? Like, is this what would the goal be here? What do you think the person, what's in it, you know?
Yeah, I think there's a couple things that are really important. Undergoing genetic testing, since we found that 1 in every 10 patients in that initial study, and that second study found a similar prevalence, 1 in every 10 patients has the pathogenic variant associated with cancer in a cancer susceptibility gene. I think it's of benefit because there's a potential to understand if there's a risk for different types of cancer in addition to that. And that's where some of that cancer prevention or surveillance strategies may come into play. Of course, warranted a detailed and individual level discussion with a genetic counselor, but I think that's really important to consider. And then secondarily, for family members. And so if there's an at-risk family member, if something is identified in genetic testing that could put family members at risk of a hereditary cancer syndrome, that's really important because it could lead to what we call cascade testing, or testing of other family members and genetic counseling of those individuals for similar reasons.
Okay, good. And have you and your team found anything yet about any specific histologies that are more predisposed to a genetic link? You know, for example, lamin versus goblet cell versus low-grade adenocarcinoma. Anything there, or is it just way too premature?
It's one of the most burning questions on my mind at the moment. Unfortunately, in that paper in the JAMA Oncology study, we looked at differences between the groups, but we didn't have enough. We looked at differences in potential histology between those with a mutation and without, but I think there's absolute value and merit to doing histology specific evaluation in understanding whether germline genetic features may differ across histologies and other characteristics overall. We're not there yet. My hope is that with a robust enrollment into the GAP study, the more patients we're able to enroll, the more likely we can do histology specific evaluations and understand how there may or may not be differences across these histological groups.
Yeah, that would be really interesting. So here's another question that may be a bit more granular, but in your presentation, you shared that 7 out of 8 patients, I believe, in the Ambry cohort reported a family history of cancer. Are there any commonalities there in terms of the type of cancer, site of origin?
Yeah, unfortunately, in that cohort, we didn't have that detailed level of information. I can tell you that the GAP study does ask for a detailed family cancer history of blood-related family members in terms of type of cancer, if somebody was diagnosed in the family, and age at cancer, but we didn't have that information. So right now, we're not so sure.
Okay, good, fair.
I'll add one more thing to that.
Please.
It's no surprise that 7 out of every 8 patients in that cohort did have a family history of cancer. And that's in part because that study period was from 2012 to 2016, where there were no genetic testing recommendations for this patient population. So the fact that these folks got genetic testing may yield an overrepresentation of those with family cancer history in that cohort, no less, which we acknowledge, and why we're hopeful that the prospective GAP study will help us better understand that overall. I do want to answer one really difficult question, and my staff can acknowledge how much I struggle with having to answer this question when we get asked it related to the GAP study. I know folks are passionate about if a family member was diagnosed with appendiceal cancer who has unfortunately passed away. Is there any way to enroll that participant on the GAP study? I have personally reached out to our regulatory committee to ask this question. And unfortunately, due to regulatory processes, we cannot accept a consent for an individual who is now deceased to enroll on the GAP study. Least favorite question to have to answer. So I just wanted to do that on my own and be transparent about it. So I know that's not the answer most folks want to hear, and I do apologize, but I can't tell you how much we appreciate you asking us and doing and wanting to participate. And I'm sorry the answer is not better than that.
Thank you. I did see those, and that's a common question, I'm sure, that you get, as you say. Dr. Holowatyj, so just getting back to that histology question, it's a little bit related, you'll see why, but did genetic testing panels test for a slew of known cancer kind of related groups in general, or would the GAP study findings result in new genetic testing panels targeted specifically toward appendix cancer? Does that make sense?
Yeah, and there's a slew of different panels, as you've acknowledged, that emphasizes the need for a genetic counselor to have the discussion on what panel and how many genes to be tested. In GAP, we're trying to go broad because we want to understand, are there new genes related to appendix cancer susceptibility that we have not yet discovered, which is partly why I encourage even folks who've had genetic testing to still join the study, because it's important. But that number and the types of panels, there are quite a few depending on the company and whatnot. But the hope is if we can causally confirm or causally discover that genetic link to appendix cancer through the GAP study and laboratory-based investigations, then that would help us understand what genes should be included on future panels for testing in this patient population.
Okay. I feel like I'm just doing rapid fire questions at you, sorry, but trying to get in as many as we can.
I said, let's talk. And
let's talk, let's go, let's
Uh,
roll. So Dr. Holowatyj, if I'm in GAP and you find something in my DNA, you indicated, I think, that you would connect that individual, refer them to a genetic counselor, or at least give them that information. I know you are not a genetic counselor, you made that clear, but what will the genetic counselor do?
Yeah, so regardless of being on GAP, no less, I think speaking with a genetic counselor is really important. They can kind of counsel through, like I said, some of those costs, benefits, risks, limitations, get a firm grasp on a family history of cancer, and then be able to have that dialogue and evaluate that decision. We, of course, are to report results back to participants. I feel very strongly about this if they choose to hear those results. I know some individuals have declined, and I respect that decision, no less, but we will afford the opportunity for everybody to receive their results and then also make those referrals or, provide some resources to find a local genetic counselor with some next steps from there.
Okay. Okay. And a couple of quick questions on eligibility. I know you covered that in your presentation quite thoroughly, but here are a couple more. If someone is a survivor, in this case, let's just say a 20-year survivor, so very long time, fantastic, congratulations. Could they still participate in the GAP study, or is there some sort of timing limitation on time from diagnosis?
No timing limitation at all, and I echo your congratulations at that 20-year, not survivor. I would change it to thriver at that point, hopefully. But there is no limitation. Typically, hospitals are required to keep records or tissues for 10 years. And so it would be unlikely that we could get that tissue, but there's still the opportunity for the genetic testing component with the saliva sample. And I do want to kind of, in thinking about it in real time from my last question, somebody may say, what do I need to know about my family cancer history, especially if I'm going to go see a genetic counselor? And so, anecdotally, I would say you want to know what family members were diagnosed with cancer, that age they were diagnosed at, and the type of cancer. And then any genetic testing results that you have are informative to also bring to that appointment. But similar to those questions that we ask in GAP, how are they related to you? What family member, how old were they at diagnosis, and what cancer type were they diagnosed with?
Okay. And then sticking, I guess, still in the general bucket of eligibility, we had a couple questions about participation by people in other countries. As I understand it, the current eligibility requirement is that one must be diagnosed in the US. Is that correct?
You are correct.
Okay.
There are several questions in the Q&A about it. Right now, you have to have been diagnosed with appendiceal cancer in the United States. There's reasons that we've started with that, but we are actively exploring ways to see if we can expand this to other countries. Sending saliva samples through customs is a challenge, as one may anticipate, no less. But we are exploring those options. And, should we get to that point, we will share that information, no less, to expand eligibility criteria.
Great, great. Okay. This next question comes up a lot, and I see it again tonight. I'm going to try to keep it as short and simple as possible, but you live in a very complicated world, Dr. Holowatyj, but let me give it my best shot. So if there is a patient and they do genetic testing, let's call it a clinically relevant genetic variant is discovered, what might they do with that information in terms of notifying family members? I mean, you did the elephant slide, which I love. But would it be that they would be at their discretion making those family members aware? And we get a zillion questions about, and how do we define that circle of family members? Is it parents, children, siblings? Does it extend out? Nieces, nephews, grandparents, cousins? Like, how do we think about that?
Yeah, so certainly a loaded question. I think based on that result, speaking with a genetic counselor and understanding what family members might be at risk to be tested would be an important next step. But you also want to think about it as the closer you are in degrees of blood-related relatives, the more DNA you share. So for example, if you're a first degree relative, siblings, children, parents, you share about half your DNA. So you're closer in heredity than a second degree relative where you would share a quarter of your DNA. So that's an uncle, an aunt, a niece or nephew, a grandparent, a grandchild. So the closer you are in the degree of relatedness, the more likely you are to have some of those same genetic variants that may warrant cascade testing or testing as a family member of somebody who has that result overall. But I do think that's an individual level conversation. And I do think that a genetic counselor is, certified and specialized in, mapping out family cancer history and understanding some of that in depth to be able to walk through some of those considerations with the patient.
And that is a point well taken. And it's a great reminder too, to me, and I think everybody else on here, that you of course cannot opine on specific individual cases or give any sort of specific advice on kind of clinical actionability in a specific case. But this is so helpful, Dr. Holowatyj, just what you can share in terms of general terms based on current thinking and what you know is just really helpful. So you mentioned sharing family cancer history is important. What medical information should patients consider collecting and sharing with their blood relatives? That question seems very related to what we just talked about, but is there anything additional that you would add?
Yeah, I think just having that conversation, maybe a relative has important information about family cancer history that you don't know about yet. It's about an exchange of information and best understanding some of that family cancer history, medical records or test results that can provide clues to help relatives make some of those medical decisions with their clinical care team overall.
Okay.
I'm going to jump in really quick.
Please go for it. Let's talk.
Yeah. So the question about testing offspring, most folks know that right now children of individuals diagnosed with appendix cancer are not eligible to join GAP. That's something, as we look into opportunities, if we do expand, that's something we would intend to share with GAP study participants. I'm not familiar with any other studies looking at appendix cancer genetics at the time, but we're mindful of that. And we often get that question about, okay, just parents or myself, no siblings, no children on study right now overall, and that point is well taken, and we're trying to explore potential opportunities to expand that in GAP. Perhaps that's a separate webinar in the future, but right now we're focused on what we have overall, but I'm not familiar with any other studies. That's a clue into the GAP study website, has an FAQ section on questions we commonly receive that gets updated. Our website has a tab on our impact where you can see some of the publications or related work related from the GAP study that we try and update in real time. And we have a GAP in action where we have opportunities such as this webinar posted for engagement or understanding and seeing in real time that we're actively working on this and in effort for it to truly be that partnership and keeping patients clued in addition to an annual newsletter that will be sent out to all GAP study participants. Deborah, I think
I think this is a good point to transition to the buzzwords of prophylactic appendectomy
Excellent.
that I
Better-
see
Yep.
have found their way repeatedly into the chat. So I know it's a burning question. So perhaps this is a good segue.
Why don't you go ahead? I mean, we get lots and lots of questions. Generally, I guess the nub of it is, so if there's a finding of a clinically relevant, potentially clinically relevant genetic link, and that information is shared with family members, should they then be thinking about getting a prophylactic appendectomy just to avoid any problems down the road? I mean, that's basically what I see.
Yep. And my answer at this point has to be no. We do not. I'm evidence-based. I look at the data, and we do not have enough evidence to discuss an appendectomy prophylactic, essentially that means having your appendix taken out if a family member with appendix cancer has a genetic variant. We lack sufficient data at this point to know enough about it to be able to make any level of that decision, particularly for a surgery that has risks involved, cost benefit. Things need to be taken into consideration. There are multiple levels of evidence that we need to evaluate before we can truly even have that conversation overall. So no is the answer to the prophylactic appendectomy. We need more information from studies like GAP in a prospective capacity that are enrolling patients to understand the level of risk and causality potentially for specific variants overall and patterns of heredity before we can move in that direction.
Okay, well, if the answer to the prophylactic scenario is no, we have questions about what could be done as kind of a risk measure. This is kind of an interesting question. Does current surveillance now include genetic testing? I know that some of the best practices are all over the map with other measures, CEA, CA19. But what about genetic testing? Are you aware of anyone incorporating that for surveillance?
No, I think what I mean by surveillance, if you've identified a genetic variant, would be if specific criteria are met, surveillance as in if there's a variant associated with an increased risk of colorectal cancer and other criteria that are established by set guidelines are met, perhaps that would be indicative of whether you should start surveillance measures like a colonoscopy more frequently or at a sooner age, et cetera. So you're surveilling for that cancer in that case in the context of genetic testing versus doing something like surveillance in CEA or ctDNA overall that's more so looking for recurrence or minimal residual disease like that.
Okay, and so then another question on that same theme, and then we can move on. Are there resources then in which family members of appendix cancer survivors could be screened for an increased risk of appendix cancer? Are you aware of anything like that?
Yeah, so I think, if somebody with appendix cancer has genetic testing and has a clinically relevant variant identified, I don't think we have enough evidence to understand the impact of that specifically on appendix cancer risk for a family member. But I think with a genetic counselor, that would help advise as to whether blood-related family members should get tested to see if they may carry that variant as well, as it could lead to an increased risk of cancer in terms of other cancer types apart from appendiceal as well.
Okay, so Dr. Holowatyj, I apologize for being repetitive, but it keeps coming up. Can you just again repeat in terms of eligibility for the GAP study? Is it so someone must be diagnosed with appendix cancer? Any other family members eligible now or no?
So right now, parents of individuals diagnosed with appendiceal cancer are eligible to participate in GAP. The reason that we have initially extended to parents is because, as I mentioned, your DNA is inherited from both your parents. So there's a chance to understand if there are changes in DNA inherited from both mom and dad that may be linked familially to appendix cancer overall. And so we've started at that point. And then we were evaluating based on participant feedback and knowing the importance of genetic testing considered in other family members if something were to be identified. We're evaluating potential to expand in the future, but right now it would be if something is found, then referral to a genetic counselor, and then having that discussion about what family members might be at risk and benefit from genetic testing as a consequence overall. Oops, I don't know if we lost Deborah for a second. So
Here I
I'm
am. No, I was on mute. I'm sorry. I was on mute.
going.
I just said, why don't you scroll through and see if you see some things? I see you're fast and furiously zipping through the Q&A.
Yeah, I think a great question is, I've had several surgeries for my appendix cancer. Which pathology reports do you want for your study? I think if you're willing and able to share all of those, we can parse through that. However, the primary one that we ask about is the pathology report related to when your appendix cancer was diagnosed for a primary tumor. So where your appendix was removed and pathology was evaluated, if that were the case. Some people have other courses in which disease is diagnosed overall there, but we would happily take any reports you're willing to share. The one related to the pathology of the appendix tumor is what we are interested in to start, because of classifying and understanding some of those histological features, which gets back to your question that I said was burning, in understanding how some of these germline features or prevalence of variants may differ across histology groups. I think it's really important that studies include patients with all histology groups overall to be representative, but also be able to tackle that important question, no less.
And so speaking of information that would be helpful, if someone has had other genetic testing done, would you want those reports?
Yeah, absolutely. If you've already had genetic testing, or if you have genomic testing like a Tempus, Caris Foundation one panel, then we welcome that. More information is always helpful to us overall.
And then I'm sure this is detailed in the GAP study information, but for you to get the information that you need, for example, pathology reports, how does that work from a process standpoint? Does the study participant do that? Do you send them the forms to sign? Is that something, presumably you have to request it maybe, but with patient consent? How does that work from a mechanistic standpoint?
So let me kind of just walk through what it looks like to join GAP. So I kind of highlighted that if you choose to participate, and head to the website and press join the GAP study. If you'd like a paper copy of the participation form to evaluate and sign, you're also welcome to email us, and we'll happily mail that to you with a return mailer. but you would read through the consent form that outlines those 5 asks and other important details like how we protect your privacy, etc. Once you sign and complete and certify that form, my staff gets a ping, and then what they have to set up as required by regulatory is a 5 to 10 minute phone call just to run through and make sure you understand what you signed and you confirm you're eligible and want to participate. And then after that phone call, you will be sent a link or a paper copy of the study survey based on your communication preference. And then in that survey, we ask about willingness to provide a saliva sample. If you have any records you want to upload at that time, you're welcome to do that. If not, just skip over that question and keep on going. Interest level and gap parent, and then on to some of the other questions overall. But signing that participation form gives us the permission to access the pathology reports, and we can reach out to that medical center. What we typically provide them is a copy of the study's ethical approval so that they know that the study is in good standing and has been thoroughly reviewed and approved. And then we provide, using secure measures, of course, a copy of the consent form signed that will give us permission to receive those documents in a secure capacity, which is whether it's a report or tissue, that gives us those permissions. So beyond the participation form and signing that, there's no other paperwork needed to sign overall.
Good. And time check, we're about at the end, believe it or not. That was a fast 90 minutes. So I don't know if you, Dr. Holowatyj, have any other questions that you wanted to answer, or if we should go ahead and wrap up. It's 8 Eastern, is 8:27. So.
Well, let me just kind of give a couple of general points. Number one, thank you to everybody for your questions. I think the chat's had over, the Q&A's had over 50 questions here, trying to keep up with. I know it's not easy sometimes to ask those questions, but I really appreciate asking them and the courage to ask them. And I apologize if I wasn't able to get to any overall. Most of all, thank you for your time, for sharing the GAP study, for participation. We recognize your time is valuable. We take it really seriously in our onus to really try and make discoveries that matter to patients and to answer really important questions. And so I assure you my team is committed as ever to fill this gap in our knowledge. And like I said in my talk, pun fully intended there overall. But yeah, if there are, as Deborah noted, I can't answer any specific case questions overall, and will not provide medical advice. But if there's a broader question, like I said, we try and answer it on the FAQ overall, and we'll try to get to those no less.
Well, I just want to very quickly, before we disappear into the vapor here with the time, I just want to thank Dr. Holowatyj for all of your time, sharing all of your information, your work, and everything that you're doing on behalf of patients and families to move us forward.
Oh my goodness, Deborah, there's all these hearts and claps. That's way too kind. It's a privilege to get to do this work. I really consider it a privilege. And, many of the participants who I know are on this call that are on GAP, my staff can tell you, I try and know the case. I read through the questionnaire. I want to understand those individual stories. Each participant matters on studies. So this is way too kind for those reactions. It's the patients and their families who should be getting all these hearts overall, not me here. But thank you very much nonetheless.
Well, no, absolutely. Thank you. And let's keep the hearts going for the patients, families, caregivers, all the other researchers, scientists, clinicians that may be on this call, nursing. Together we are stronger. No one fights alone. Thank you all. And stay tuned. We're going to send out a quick survey, and definitely stay tuned for our next webinar, which we hope to have in June, toward the end of June. But thank you, Dr. Holowatyj. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, everyone. Have a fantastic evening.